My father used to say Canada trained the sky before it fought in it. By 1942, thousands of Canadian airmen crossed the Atlantic. But once they arrived, many disappeared into Royal Air Force squadrons, their nationality barely mentioned. Years later, in government correspondence and Royal Canadian Air Force files I've listed in the description, I found the tension that followed. Canada wasn't asking for more aircraft, it was asking to be recognized. Here is the story.
1942. England. Somewhere in the damp gray of a Yorkshire dawn, Canadian bomber crews climbed down from their aircraft after a night raid over Germany. Their boots hit wet tarmac. Their ears still ring. The headlines the next morning read simply, RAF strikes Ruhr. No mention of Canada. Back home, families open newspapers and ask a dangerous question. If our sons are dying in the skies over Europe, why are they invisible? Before the first bomb fell, before the first engine failed over the North Sea, there was a plan. Not a battle plan. A training plan. And it would reshape a nation. In December 1939, just months after war was declared, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand signed an agreement that would become one of the most ambitious aviation undertakings in human history. It was called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, a large-scale multinational military aircrew training program. Its purpose was singular and urgent. Produce the pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, air gunners, and flight engineers that the Allied cause would need to survive. Canada was chosen as the primary location for the plan's training operations. The reasons were practical, not sentimental. Canada had suitable weather, wide open spaces ideal for extensive flight and navigation training, closeness to the United States' industrial centers and supplies of fuel, the lack of any threat from enemy aircraft, and its proximity to the European theater of war. And so the prairies were transformed. Throughout Canada, experts gathered. Airfields started to spring up in wheat fields. Existing airfields were repurposed, and new training establishments opened almost on a weekly basis. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and southern Ontario were especially suitable for novice pilots due to their flat landscape, open skies, and generally clear weather. Towns that had never heard the sound of an aero engine suddenly shook with it every morning. Farmers paused in their fields and looked up at yellow training aircraft circling in wide, uncertain arcs. The scale was staggering. At the plan's peak, there were 107 schools and 184 ancillary units at 231 sites operating across Canada, staffed by 104,113 men and women, and home to 10,906 aircraft. The government built 7,000 hangars, barracks, and drill halls for the air bases and training schools. Enough concrete was used in creating the runways for all the BCA-TP air bases to build a 20-foot wide highway from Ottawa to Vancouver, and the cost fell overwhelmingly on Canadian shoulders. The Canadian government paid approximately $1.6 billion, nearly three-quarters of the total cost of $2.2 billion. This was a country with a small population, still scarred by the Depression, spending more on air training alone than most nations spent on their entire war effort in those early years. More than 130,000 crewmen and women were trained between 1939 and 1945, making this one of Canada's great contributions to Allied victory in the war. It led United States President Franklin Roosevelt to call Canada the aerodrome of democracy. But beneath the pride was a quiet condition. Canada had not agreed to train the world's Air Force out of charity alone. The King government demanded that Canadians be identified as members of the Royal Canadian Air Force by their shoulder badge. This was not vanity, it was sovereignty. Canada was no longer a colony. It had gained full legal autonomy through the Statute of Westminster in 1931, and it intended to be recognized for what it gave. The expectation was clear. Canada would provide the training, the airfields, the money, the manpower, and in return, its airmen would be seen, would be counted, would fly under their own flag. That was the expectation. It would not survive contact with London. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe so these stories aren't lost. The promise had a name. Article 15. Buried in the dense legalese of the 1939 agreement, it was just 2 sentences long. But those sentences carried the weight of national identity. The clause stipulated that the United Kingdom government undertook that pupils of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand would, after training was completed, be identified with their respective dominions, either by the method of organizing dominion units and formations, or in some other way. This was largely an initiative of the Canadian Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, during the negotiations. Always leery of the possibility of casualties and the overall cost of RCAF overseas commitments, King was adamant that anything impinging on Canadian sovereignty or that could be interpreted as being subservient to Great Britain had to be dealt with before the plan was agreed to. The agreement was signed on December 17, 1939. The official announcement was made later that day, on the 65th birthday of the Canadian Prime Minister. King had timed it that way. A birthday gift to himself, a gift to the nation. But the wording of Article 15 was deliberately vague. Although the wording of this article permitted the training agreement to be finalized, it merely delayed resolution of problems dealing with national units and identification to a later date. The British had signed it to get the plan moving. The Canadians had signed it believing it meant something. Both were right in their own way, and both would pay for the ambiguity. On January 7, 1941, Ralston and Sir Archibald Sinclair, the British Secretary of State for Air, signed an agreement stipulating that pilots and aircrew would be incorporated into 25 RCAF squadrons to be formed over an 18-month period. These would be known as Article 15 squadrons, bearing the 400 series numbers that specifically identified them as Canadian. In theory, this was the architecture of recognition. Canadian-trained airmen would serve in Canadian-designated squadrons, wearing Canadian uniforms, carrying their identity into battle. In practice, reality tore that architecture apart. In practice, and technically in contravention of Article 15, most personnel from other Commonwealth countries, while they were under RAF operational control, were assigned to British units. The reasons were always operational. The RAF needed bodies in specific squadrons at specific times. A Canadian navigator might arrive at an operational training unit and be assigned wherever the gap existed, not to a Canadian squadron, to whatever squadron needed a warm body that week. There was no malice in this. Or rather, the malice was structural, not personal. The RAF was fighting a war. It needed flexibility. National designations, from London's perspective, were bureaucratic luxuries that slowed down the machinery of survival. And so Canadian airmen scattered across Britain. They flew in RAF squadrons. They ate in RAF messes. They wore RCAF shoulder badges that no one looked at. Their names appeared on operational records under squadron numbers that carried no hint of Canada. The issues of national identity, different treatment for Canadians serving in the RAF, and the complete manning of RCAF units with Canadians, so-called Canadianization, would continue to be a source of friction between the two air forces and governments. A promise had been made. A promise on paper. And paper burns easily in the engines of war. To understand the anger that would follow, you must first understand the dying. Bomber Command was, by any measure, one of the most lethal assignments in the entire Allied war effort. The men who flew heavy bombers over Germany did so with the quiet understanding that the odds were against them. Not slightly, overwhelmingly. A standard tour of operations was 30 missions. 30 times you climbed into a Lancaster or a Halifax or a Wellington. 30 times you flew into the dark, into the flak, into the searchlights, into the night fighters that hunted you with radar and cannons. At times, in the great offensives of 1943 and 1944, the short-term statistics foretold that less than 25 out of each 100 crews would survive their first tour of 30 operations. The Ruhr Valley was the most frequent destination, the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. Essen, Hanau, Dortmund, Duisburg, Cologne, cities ringed with anti-aircraft batteries, defended by searchlight belts that could illuminate a bomber, was to enter a lottery where the prize was the Kammhuber Line, a belt of radar-directed night fighters that stretched across the approach routes. To fly through it was to enter a lottery where the prize was survival and the odds shortened with every mission. The cold at altitude was brutal. 20,000 feet over Europe in an unpressurized bomber, the temperature could drop to -40. Turret gunners, exposed in their perspex domes, suffered frostbite even through their layers of heated clothing. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Hydraulic fluid thickened. Metal became so cold it burned bare skin. And through all of this, Canadian airmen flew, night after night, over the Ruhr, over Hamburg, over Berlin. They flew the same routes, faced the same defenses, and died in the same numbers as their British counterparts. In many cases, higher numbers. During the RCAF's Halifax operations between March 1943 and February 1944, the average loss rate was 6.05%, producing a mere 16% survival rate for a tour of 30 operations. The losses were not abstract. They were personal. A crew of 7 in a Lancaster meant 7 families, 7 sets of parents, 7 towns in Canada waiting for a telegram. When a bomber failed to return, the empty bed in the Nissen hut was usually filled within 48 hours. The new man would ask no questions. The old hands would offer no stories. A total of 9,919 RCAF airmen died while serving with Bomber Command, whether in 6 Group or in some other unit. This figure represents 3/4 of the RCAF's 13,498 wartime casualties, and a significant number of those Canadians were not even serving in Canadian squadrons. 46% of Canadians and other RCAF killed were serving on RAF Bomber Command squadrons. They died wearing RCAF badges, but their deaths were recorded under RAF squadron numbers. Back in Canada, the casualty lists arrived by mail. Names printed in small type in local newspapers. Mothers in Winnipeg, fathers in Halifax, sweethearts in Vancouver. They read the names and looked for context, for meaning, for some acknowledgement that their boy had been part of something. The newspapers offered little. The dispatches from London described RAF raids, RAF victories, RAF losses. The word Canada appeared rarely, and when it did, it was often buried deep in the text, an afterthought in a British story. The questions began quietly, in living rooms, in church halls, in post offices where telegrams arrived. Why does it say RAF? He was RCAF. He trained in Saskatchewan. He was Canadian. Why doesn't it say that? It was not yet outrage, but it was unease. And unease in wartime is a crack in the foundation. The newspapers noticed what the government had hoped to manage quietly. When Bomber Command struck German targets, the dispatches released to the press followed British conventions. The raids were described as RAF operations. The participating units were listed by their RAF designations. The national origins of the crews went unreported, not by conspiracy, but by the structure of the reporting itself. In the language of the Air Ministry, there was no Canada. There was only the Royal Air Force. This was not accidental. It was institutional. Britain was fighting for survival, and the war effort was presented as a unified imperial undertaking. Drawing attention to the national composition of individual squadrons served no military purpose from London's perspective. It complicated the narrative, and in wartime, narratives matter. But Canada had its own narrative, and it was cracking. Members of Parliament began raising the issue in the House of Commons. They spoke carefully at first, framing their concerns as questions of fairness rather than accusations of deliberate erasure. Was it not true, they asked, that Canadian airmen were disproportionately represented in Bomber Command? Was it not true that Canada was bearing both the cost of training and the cost of casualties? And if so, why were these contributions invisible in the public record? The questions landed on the desk of the Minister of National Defence for Air, Charles Gavin Power. He understood the politics with surgical clarity. English-speaking Canada wanted to see its war effort recognized. French-speaking Canada wanted to know why young men were dying in a British war. Both pressures pointed towards the same conclusion. Canada's contribution had to be visible, not just to the people at home, but to history itself. Families felt it most acutely. A mother who lost her son wanted to grieve a Canadian airman, not a statistical entry in an RAF operations report. A father who saw his son's training, photographed beside a tiger moth on a Manitoba prairie, could not reconcile that image with a headline that read, "RAF hammers Berlin." The dissonance was not intellectual, it was emotional. And emotional dissonance, when multiplied across thousands of families, becomes political. The newspapers in Toronto, Winnipeg, and Montreal began publishing editorials. They did not accuse Britain of malice. They accused the system of blindness. They pointed out that Canada was spending more per capita on the air war than almost any other allied nation, yet receiving less credit than nations that had contributed far less. The editorial pages asked a question that no one in Ottawa wanted to answer publicly. At what point does loyalty become erasure? William Lyon Mackenzie King was not a man of grand gestures. He was cautious, methodical, and deeply political in the truest sense of the word. He read the mood of the country the way a sailor reads the wind, constantly adjusting, always aware that one wrong tack could capsize everything. As Nazi ground and air forces had moved across Europe, echoes of the human cost of the Great War reverberated in the hearts of Canadians, and King had promised the voters no overseas conscription. He had to come up with a solution that would allow Canada to contribute meaningfully to the war effort without enacting conscription. Mackenzie King wanted to keep Canada's war effort limited to avoid a repetition of the tensions of the First World War. He needed to convince English Canada that serious efforts were being made to support the British, while also assuring French Canada that conscription would be avoided at all costs. The BCATP had been his answer, a massive contribution that kept most Canadians on Canadian soil. Training, not fighting. Building, not dying. It was elegant. It was practical. And it had worked, politically, for nearly 3 years. But by 1942, the equation had shifted. Tens of thousands of Canadian airmen were now overseas. They were fighting, they were dying, and they were invisible. King understood what invisibility meant. It meant that the sacrifice could not be honored. It meant that the contribution could not be claimed. It meant that after the war, when the histories were written and the monuments were erected, Canada's name might not appear where it should. And for a man who believed that national identity was the most fragile and precious thing a country possessed, that was unacceptable. But King also understood the alliance. He understood that pushing too hard, too publicly, risked fracturing the relationship with Britain at a moment when unity mattered more than pride. He was not naive. He knew that Churchill's government viewed the Dominions as junior partners, valued for their contributions, but not expected to make demands. To insist on Canadian visibility was, in British eyes, to prioritize sentiment over strategy. Worried about the optics of having the former mother country absorbing too much control, the Prime Minister was unflinching in his demands that the Canadian government, as well as the RCAF, were the ones who were actually responsible for the BCATP. The story of the BCATP was worth exploring because it represented a sign of the country's growing maturity. For a country that only 8 years earlier had gained full legal autonomy from Britain through the Statute of Westminster, the BCATP further symbolized Canada's desire to develop its own sense of nationalism and direction as a completely independent state. King faced his dilemma in the quiet of his office. He consulted his ministers. He read the intelligence summaries. He reviewed the casualty reports. And somewhere in the autumn of 1942, he made his decision. Canada would push back, not loudly, not theatrically, but firmly, diplomatically, through channels. The instruction went out to the Canadian High Commission in London. The instruction was simple in its framing and enormous in its implications. Canadian airmen must fly as Canadians. They must be grouped together under Canadian command in Canadian formations, and those formations must be recognized publicly as Canadian. It was the most consequential aviation directive King would ever issue, and it would take every ounce of leverage Canada possessed to make it real. The push came through official channels, but it carried the force of a nation's frustration behind it. Canadian officials in London, led by the RCAF's Overseas Command, began making formal representations to the Air Ministry. The message was consistent. The dispersion of Canadian aircrews across RAF squadrons was no longer acceptable. Article 15 had promised national identification. The Ralston-Sinclair Agreement of 1941 had formalized the commitment to Canadian squadrons. Yet in practice, the RCAF had begun participating in operations by RAF Bomber Command in 1941, but its squadrons were initially attached to RAF groups, and many individual RCAF personnel belonged to RAF aircrews in RAF squadrons. Ottawa wanted concentration, not merely squadrons carrying Canadian numbers, but Canadian squadrons grouped together under a Canadian headquarters, operating as a recognizable Canadian formation within the Allied structure. The British response was predictable. The Air Ministry raised operational concerns. Grouping squadrons by nationality, they argued, created rigidity. What if a Canadian squadron suffered heavy losses and needed immediate replacements? What if operational demands required flexibility in squadron assignments? National groupings, they contended, would slow down the machinery of Bomber Command at a time when every sortie mattered. The Canadian politicians pleaded the case of a special Canadian group to be established within Bomber Command. The heads of the RAF and Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal and Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, had their reserves about this, in their minds, colonial experiment, but finally they did agree. There was also an unspoken dimension to the resistance. If Canada was granted its own bomber group, Australia and New Zealand would likely demand the same. The precedent would fragment the command structure along national lines, creating political complexity within what the British wanted to maintain as a unified force. Behind closed doors, the discussions grew sharp. Canadian representatives pointed to the casualty figures. They pointed to the training statistics. They pointed to the financial statements. The subtext was unmistakable. Canada was not asking for a favor. Canada was calling in an obligation. Canada wanted its own identifiable presence in Allied air operations overseas, and it did not want its Air Force to be merely a source of manpower for the Royal Air Force. The tension was real, but it was managed. Neither side wanted a public rupture. Britain could not afford to alienate the nation that was hosting and financing the world's largest air training system. Canada could not afford to be seen as obstructing the Allied war effort for the sake of national pride. The negotiations happened in meeting rooms, in memoranda, in carefully worded cables that traveled beneath the Atlantic. What emerged was not a concession born of generosity. It was an acknowledgement born of leverage, and Canada knew exactly how much leverage it held. The leverage was quiet. It did not announce itself, but it was overwhelming. By 1942, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was not merely Canada's contribution to the war. It was one of the war's indispensable engines. The BCATP remains one of the single largest aviation training programs in history and was responsible for training nearly half the pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, air gunners, wireless operators, and flight engineers who served with the RAF, Fleet Air Arm, RAAF, RCAF, and RNZAF during the war. Without Canada, there was no bomber command at full strength. Without Canada, there were no replacement crews for the ceaseless losses over Germany. Without Canada, the entire pipeline of Allied air power constricted to a trickle, and Canada was paying for almost all of it. The final cost of the BCATP ended up being $2,231,129,039.26, of which Canada contributed $1,617,958,108.79. After the war, the Canadian government calculated that Great Britain owed Canada more than $425 million for running British schools transferred to Canada and for purchasing aircraft and other equipment when Great Britain could not provide the necessary numbers. By March 1946, the Canadian government had cancelled the debt and absorbed the cost. This was not the behavior of a supplicant. This was the behavior of a nation that understood its power and chose to exercise it with restraint. The leverage extended beyond money. 72,835 graduates joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. More than half of all BCATP graduates were Canadian. The country was not only training the world's Air Force, it was providing the largest share of the product. Remove Canada from the equation, and the math of the air war collapsed. Canadian negotiators did not frame their demands as rebellion. They framed them as partnership. A partnership, they argued, required visibility. It required that the sacrifices of one partner not be subsumed into the identity of another. The language was always measured, the tone was always respectful, but the substance was steel. The British government was of the opinion in 1940 that the BCATP effort would require all of Canada's air resources, and that the formation of Canadian Air Force operational units overseas was not practical. However, because of World War I experience and the strong national identity in Canada that followed that war, the Canadian government had adopted a policy of maintaining national control over all military units sent for combat overseas, Army, Navy, and eventually Air Force. This was the precedent. Canadian Army divisions overseas had always retained their identities, even when operating within British strategic formations. The 1st Canadian Army fought as Canadians. The infantry divisions were known as Canadian. Their victories were reported as Canadian. Their dead were mourned as Canadian. The Air Force, Ottawa now insisted, would follow the same principle. Not because it was convenient, because it was essential. The prairie wind still blew across the training fields of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The tiger moths and Avro ansons still circled in the Canadian sky. The machinery of the BCATP still hummed. And behind that hum was the quiet confidence of a nation that knew it could not be replaced. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic flourish. It arrived, as most consequential things do, through accumulation. The weight of argument, the weight of evidence, the weight of leverage applied steadily over months until the structure on the other side bent. By the autumn of 1942, the British position had shifted. Not entirely, and not without conditions, but perceptibly. The Air Ministry, facing the combined pressure of Canadian diplomacy, Canadian financing, and Canadian manpower contributions, agreed in principle to the formation of a distinct Canadian bomber group within RAF Bomber Command. The Canadian government wanted RCAF bomber squadrons and personnel to be concentrated, as much as possible, in a distinct, identifiably Canadian group. To this end, 6 RCAF Group was formed on 25 October 1942 with 8 squadrons. The designation was transferred from the old RAF No. 6 Group, which was renamed No. 91 Group, clearing the way for a Canadian formation to carry the number forward. No. 6, Bomber. Group RAF was renamed No. 91, Bomber. Group RAF on 11 May 1942, and the 6 Group designation was transferred to the RCAF on 25 October 1942. The agreement came with conditions. The Canadian group would operate within the framework of Bomber Command. Its missions would be assigned by Bomber Command Headquarters. Its operational orders would come down the same chain of command that governed every other group. Canada would have administrative autonomy, its own headquarters, its own commanders, its own infrastructure. But operationally, 6 Group would answer to Arthur Harris, just as every other group did. This was the compromise. Canada got identity. Britain retained control. And both sides could present the arrangement as a victory. No. 6. Group RCAF was made up of Article 15 squadrons, RCAF units, formed under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan for service with British operational formations, hence number. 6 Group was part of Royal Air Force Bomber Command. The squadrons began assembling. Existing RCAF squadrons that had been scattered across various RAF groups were now consolidated. New squadrons were stood up in rapid succession. In June 1942, the RCAF's 1st Francophone Unit, 425 Squadron, was formed in an effort to recruit French Canadians into the Air Force. In October, it was followed by 2 more squadrons, 424 and 426, all on the Wellington. By now, the idea of creating an all-Canadian bomber group had firmly taken hold, and 4 squadrons were hurriedly stood up in November. 427, 428, 429, and 431, all equipped with Wellingtons. The pace of expansion was deliberate but relentless. Canada was not going to let this opportunity pass. Every new squadron formed was another brick in the wall of national identity. Every crew posted to a Canadian unit was one fewer Canadian lost in the anonymous machinery of an RAF squadron. But the speed of the build-up carried risks. The group was being assembled in the middle of a bombing offensive. There was no pause, no quiet period to train and consolidate. The squadrons would have to learn to operate as a group while the war continued around them, and the war offered no patience to newcomers. No. 6. Group RCAF officially assumed operational status at 0001 hours on January 1, 1943, 1 minute past midnight. The most powerful strike force Canada had ever possessed came into being in the darkness, which was fitting because it would spend most of its existence operating in darkness. During the next 3 days, the RAF handed over to the group 6 stations with the RCAF squadrons established there: Leeming, Middleton Street, George, Dishforth, Croft, Dalton, Skipton-on-Swale, still under construction. These were the Canadian airfields now, scattered across the Vale of York in northeast England, a landscape of flat green fields, low grey clouds, and medieval churches whose steeples served as landmarks for returning bombers. Headquarters for No. 6 Group was established at Allerton Hall in Yorkshire, the gloomy 75-room ancestral home of Lord Mowbray, which was requisitioned by the British. The Canadians referred to their headquarters as Castle Dismal. It was a strange and fitting home, a crumbling English manor, cold and damp, filled with Canadian officers who spent their nights plotting the destruction of German cities on maps spread across polished tables. The incongruity was total. The severity was not. The first commanding officer was Air Vice Marshal George Eric Brooks. Brooks was born in Yorkshire, but had emigrated with his parents to Canada when he was 16. The family had established themselves in the little town of Owen Sound in southern Ontario. He was, in a sense, the perfect symbol of the group itself. A man born in England, made in Canada, returned to England to lead Canadians in an English war that was not entirely English. In the night of 3 to 4 January 1943, No. 427 Squadron RCAF flew the first mission of the Canadian group, 6 Wellingtons into the dark. The target was a mine-laying operation. It was modest, it was unglamorous, but it was Canadian. For the first time, the mission report carried a Canadian group designation. The bureaucratic, shorthand that had erased a nation's identity, now bore its name. The maple leaf insignia appeared on aircraft. Canadian ground crew serviced Canadian bombers. Canadian intelligence officers briefed Canadian pilots. The mess halls filled with accents from Saskatoon and Montreal and St. John's and Calgary. At the peak of its strength, 6 Group consisted of 14 squadrons. 15 squadrons would eventually serve with the group, which was almost every RCAF heavy bomber squadron. It was not yet a polished formation. It was rough and untested and short on experience. The squadrons had been assembled quickly, many of them brand new, their crews green and their aircraft often outdated. 6 Group continued to fly obsolete Wellington and Halifax bombers and only received their first Lancaster bombers in August 1943. But it existed. It bore a Canadian name. And in the dark sky above Yorkshire, that name was now part of the war. The missions came fast. There was no easing in. Bomber Command's offensive was escalating through 1943, and 6 Group was expected to contribute from its first night. The targets were the familiar litany of Bomber Command's strategic vision: the Ruhr industrial belt, the U-boat pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, Hamburg, Berlin. Significant operations involving 6 Group included raids on U-boat bases in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, France, and night bombing raids on industrial complexes and urban centers in Germany. By mid-1943, Canadian bomber crews were making nightly bombing runs on Germany, hoping to weaken that nation's ability to produce war material. Lancaster and Halifax bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on factories and steel mills. They also deluged the German cities of Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Berlin with bombs. The experience of a 6 Group crew was identical to that of any Bomber Command crew, with one critical addition: geography. The aircrews serving in 6 Group were based in the Vale of York, requiring longer flights to Germany. The Vale of York was also a region inclined to be foggy and icy in the winter, making takeoffs and landings dangerous. Every mile added to the flight path was another mile of fuel burned, another minute of exposure to night fighters, another increment of fatigue on the return. The crews lived in a rhythm of tension and boredom. Days spent sleeping, writing letters, playing cards, trying not to think. Evenings spent in briefing rooms, watching the red ribbon on the map stretch toward another German city. Nights spent in the sky, breathing canned oxygen, watching for the blue glow of an exhaust that might be a Junkers 88 sliding into position behind them. And mornings, if they were lucky, spent taxiing back to dispersal, climbing down stiff-legged, walking to the debriefing room for hot tea and questions. The lucky ones did this 30 times and went home. The unlucky ones did it fewer. During its first 12 months, 6. Group grew from 8 to 13 squadrons, flew 7,355 missions, and dropped 13,630 tons of bombs. And something shifted. Not in the air, on the ground, at home. Canadian newspapers now had a formation to report on. When 6 Group flew, it was Canadian bombers that flew. When the reports came back, they carried a Canadian designation. The press in Toronto and Winnipeg and Halifax could now write headlines that said what they had always wanted to say. Canadians over Germany. Canadian bombers strike Ruhr. RCAF crews hit Berlin. The effect on morale was immediate and profound. Families who had felt their sons were swallowed into a British machine now saw their sons reflected in the national press. The sacrifice had a name. The name was Canadian, and that mattered more than any politician had predicted. But recognition came at a price. Now that the group was visible, so were its failures, and the early months of 6 Group were not without them. The first year of 6 Group was painful. The initial experiences of 6 Group were not entirely auspicious. It had expanded too quickly, and the lack of seasoned air and ground crew as well as administrative personnel soon showed. Loss, early return, and serviceability rates were the worst in Bomber Command. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Number 6. Group lost 100 bombers in air raids over Germany, suffering a 7% loss ratio in some periods. Morale suffered because of the heavy losses, with many bombers becoming unserviceable, failed to take off, or returned early. The problem was structural, not moral. The group had been assembled from scratch at extraordinary speed. Many of its crews were fresh from training, with minimal operational experience. Its aircraft were often older models. The initial decision to equip Number 6 Group with outdated Wellington and Halifax bombers was influenced by strategic decisions within RAF Bomber Command and the limited availability of more advanced aircraft like the Lancaster. This allocation not only impacted the group's operational effectiveness, but also underscored the logistical and strategic challenges faced by the RCAF in asserting its autonomy within the broader RAF structure. The early return rate was a particular source of friction. Some 6 Group aircraft turned back before reaching their targets, citing mechanical failures or weather conditions. In a force where pressing on regardless was the cultural expectation, early returns were seen as a mark of inadequacy. Or worse. Harris was especially concerned about the high percentage of bombers of Number 6 Group that returned from a mission before the target had been reached. According to Harris, this high percentage was due to low morale as a consequence of mediocre leadership. He thought Brooks to be too much of a fatherly figure, instead of the dynamic leader he liked to see heading his groups. Brooks and his staff made an effort in the fall of 1943 to decrease the number of early returning aircraft, but with little effect. Crews were to prove with photographs that they were forced to return early and were extensively interrogated about this. The criticism stung. Canada had fought for the right to operate as a distinct formation, and now that formation was struggling. The irony was not lost on anyone. Recognition meant accountability. Visibility meant that failures, not just successes, would carry a Canadian name. But within the group, something harder and quieter was happening. Experience was accumulating. New crews were learning from old hands. Maintenance procedures were improving. The transition from Wellingtons to Halifaxes, and eventually to Lancasters, brought better equipment. Slowly, incrementally, the performance curve began to bend upward. The additional training demanded by the Canadian commanders and the experience gained through perilous missions over Germany allowed 6 Group to substantially improve its performance and reduce its loss ratio to a level equivalent to that of other bomber command groups. The cost of this improvement was measured in lives. Every lesson learned in the night sky was paid for with a crew that did not return. The improvement was real, but it was bought with blood. And the Canadian commanders knew it. Identity, it turned out, was not a gift. It was a burden that demanded excellence, and 6 Group was determined to carry it. The relationship between 6 Group and the man who controlled Bomber Command was never simple. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, known inevitably as Bomber Harris, was a man of absolute conviction. He believed in the strategic bombing of Germany with a ferocity that bordered on doctrine. He ran Bomber Command with an iron hand, and he viewed national distinctions within his force as complications that interfered with efficiency. The Chief of Bomber Command, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, was not satisfied with Brooks and took his command away from him. Harris replaced Brooks in February 1944 and appointed Air Vice Marshal Clifford McEwen as the new head of No. 6 Group. The change of command was significant. Clifford Mackay McEwen, known as Black Mike, was a fighter pilot and ace from the First World War, a senior Air Force commander, and a noted disciplinarian. He had grown up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. He was in every sense a Canadian. And he brought a Canadian toughness to the role. McEwen, a noted disciplinarian and stickler for regulations, instituted a rigorous training program. Although it was initially unpopular, the program improved both performance and morale. McEwen also earned his airmen's respect through personal bravery. Orders prohibited senior officers from flying operationally, but McEwen occasionally flew aboard a bomber for difficult missions, disguised as a flight sergeant. This was leadership by example. A commanding officer who put on a flight sergeant's uniform and climbed into a Lancaster heading for the Ruhr was not merely inspecting his force. He was declaring that he would not ask his men to face anything he would not face himself. The crews knew it. And it changed the culture. Under McEwen, 6 Group tightened. The early return rate dropped. The training intensified. The maintenance improved. The transition to better aircraft accelerated. Conversion to different aircraft and improved models continued throughout the war. Eventually, 4 squadrons were equipped with 4-engine Handley Page Halifaxes and 11 with 4-engine Avro Lancasters, including Canadian-built models. The Lancaster was generally considered to be the best British-designed heavy bomber of the war, in terms of survivability and bomb load. But the politics of the relationship with Bomber Command headquarters never fully resolved. Harris wanted efficiency. Ottawa wanted identity. McEwen navigated between them with the skill of a man who understood both worlds. He gave Harris the operational performance he demanded. He gave Ottawa the national presence it needed, and he held the two in tension without letting either break. Among the Canadian squadrons, No. 405 distinguished itself by the accuracy of its bomb aiming and was designated for target indicator operations. In April 1943, while remaining affiliated to 6 Group, it was transferred to 8 Group Pathfinder. This was significant. To be selected as a Pathfinder squadron, the elite marker, force of Bomber Command, was to be judged among the best. A Canadian squadron had earned that distinction. The balance between autonomy and integration was never perfect. It was never meant to be. Coalition warfare is inherently messy, filled with competing interests and overlapping authorities. What mattered was that Canada maintained its presence without fracturing the unity of the command. It was a diplomatic achievement as much as a military one. And it was achieved not in conference rooms, but in the night sky over Germany, one mission at a time. Why did it matter? In the middle of a war that consumed nations, why did the question of whose name appeared on a mission report carry such weight? The answer lies in what war does to nations, particularly small ones. Canada in 1939 had a population of approximately 11 million people. It was, by the standards of the great powers, a modest country. Its economy was heavily reliant on natural resources. Its military had been stripped to near nothingness during the interwar years. When Canada declared war against Germany on 10th September 1939, the RCAF consisted of 8 regular and 12 auxiliary squadrons with a total strength of approximately 4,000 men at all ranks. From these humble beginnings, the RCAF would rapidly expand to become the world's 4th largest air force, peaking at a strength of 215,000 personnel and fielding 80 operational squadrons. That transformation was extraordinary. But transformation demands recognition to be complete. A nation that contributes disproportionately to a common cause, but receives no credit for that contribution is diminished, not just in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of its own people. Public morale in wartime is not sustained by facts alone. It is sustained by narrative, by the story a nation tells itself about what it is doing and why. When that narrative is absent, when the sacrifice is real, but the credit is invisible, the morale cracks. People continue to give, but they give with resentment rather than resolve. And resentment, once it takes root, is difficult to extract. The BCATP was Canada's major contribution to the early war effort and was an important and unifying national achievement. But contribution without attribution is philanthropy. And Canada was not a charity. It was a sovereign nation engaged in a war of survival, and it deserved to be treated as one. The creation of 6 Group addressed this directly. It gave Canada a visible, identifiable presence in the most demanding arm of the Allied air offensive. When 6 Group struck a target, Canada struck that target. When 6 Group suffered losses, Canada suffered those losses. The connection between the sacrifice and the nation was now explicit, unambiguous, and public. This was not just about pride, though pride was part of it. It was about the relationship between a nation and its citizens in wartime. A government that sends its young men to die has an obligation to ensure that their deaths are acknowledged, not as statistics in a foreign ledger, but as sacrifices made by a specific nation for a specific cause. Without that acknowledgement, the social contract of wartime frays. And once it frays, it is very difficult to repair. Canada's insistence on visibility was, therefore, not a luxury. It was a necessity. A necessity born of the understanding that nations are made not just by what they do, but by whether anyone knows they did it. The air war was building Canada in ways that the politicians only dimly understood. Every mission flown under a Canadian banner, every crew that returned to a Canadian airfield, every casualty report that bore a Canadian squadron number was another thread in the fabric of a national identity that had been, until that point, still under construction. By 1944, 6 Group had found its footing. The painful lessons of the first year had been absorbed. The leadership transition from Brooks to McEwen had brought new energy and discipline. And the aircraft, finally, were improving. By the end of 1944, 6 Group was suffering the lowest losses of any of the bomber command groups and the highest accuracy in bombing targets. During McEwen's command, the performance of the RCAF was greatly improved, becoming the most successful Allied bombing force in several ways. By late 1944, the RCAF had both the best survival rate and the highest accuracy of any bombing force. The turnaround was remarkable. A formation that had been criticized for its early return rates and high losses was now outperforming every other group in the command. Canadian crews who had been dismissed as green and undisciplined were now setting the standard. The final offensives of 1944 and 1945 were devastating. Bomber Command, now equipped with massive forces of Lancasters and Halifaxes, struck German industry with a weight of ordnance that defied imagination. Oil refineries, transportation networks, synthetic fuel plants. The Ruhr, already scarred beyond recognition, was hit again and again. 6 Group participated in all of it. Canadian Lancasters flew over the Rhine. Canadian bomb aimers marked targets in the heart of the Reich. Canadian gunners fought off night fighters in the final, desperate months when the Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense of the homeland. For D-Day, the invasion of Europe on June 6, 1944, the RCAF committed 37 squadrons in support of the landings. These included fighter and reconnaissance squadrons directly supporting the landings, coastal patrol squadrons looking for German U-boats and warships, and bomber squadrons attacking German coastal defenses and lines of communication. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. When war ended in Europe, 6 Group took part with other Bomber Command squadrons in Operation Exodus, the repatriation of war prisoners to England. The Lancasters that had carried bombs now carried food and freed men. The aircraft that had destroyed now restored. It was a strange inversion, and the crews felt it. By the end of the war, 6 Group had flown 40,822 sorties, dropped 126,122 tons of bombs, and lost 814 aircraft. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. Of Canada's armed forces, 17,101 died in the RCAF during the war. Altogether, 9,980 Canadians were killed in bombing raids against German cities between 1940 and 1945, making the strategic bombing offensive one of the most costly operations for Canada in World War II. Then 6 Group was dismantled. 8 squadrons were chosen for Tiger Force, the final assault against Japan. Starting May 31, 1945, they flew back home with their Canadian-made Lancasters. But the war in the Pacific came to an end before the Canadian squadrons had a chance to get involved. The squadrons that remained in Great Britain were disbanded in the 12 months following VE Day. The group that had taken 2 years to build was dissolved in months. The airfields in Yorkshire fell silent, the mess halls emptied, the Nissen huts grew cold. But what had been built could not be unbuilt. Not the airfields. Those would revert to farmland. But the idea that Canada could operate its own formation, under its own command, within an Allied structure, and perform at the highest level. That idea survived. And it would shape everything that followed. The war ended. The dead were buried. The living came home. And the lessons of the air war sank into the institutional memory of a nation. Canada emerged from the Second World War transformed, not just economically or militarily, but psychologically. The country that had entered the war as Britain's loyal dominion exited it as something different. A nation that had insisted on its own identity in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and had won. The fight for 6 Group had been, in retrospect, a rehearsal for every negotiation that would follow. When Canada joined NATO in 1949, The lessons of the air war were present in every discussion about force structure and national control. Canadian units in Europe would serve within the alliance, but they would serve as Canadian units. Never again would Canadian forces be absorbed into another nation's command structure without a Canadian designation. During the First World War, Canadians had flown as individual members of the British forces. A Canadian Air Force did not exist. This time, however, as a result of Article 15 and the 1941 sub-agreement, Canadian aircrew overseas flew in Canadian squadrons under Canadian command. The 400 series squadrons that had been born from Article 15 survived. Many of those squadrons, which began their service 75 years ago as a result of the BCATP, continue to fly, serving Canada and Canadians to this day. The organizational DNA of the wartime RCAF passed directly into the post-war Air Force and then into the modern Canadian Armed Forces. The institutional memory was specific. It remembered the frustration of seeing Canadian achievements credited to the RAF. It remembered the months of negotiation required to form a single bomber group. It remembered the unspoken contempt of some British officers who viewed the colonial experiment with skepticism, and it resolved quietly and permanently that it would not happen again. This resolution shaped Canadian defense policy for decades. When Canadian forces deployed to Korea, they deployed as Canadians. When Canadian peacekeepers served with the United Nations, they served under their own flag. When Canadian ships sailed with multinational task forces, they sailed with Canadian ensigns. The principle was always the same: contribute generously, cooperate fully, but never disappear. The men who had fought in 6 Group carried this principle home in their bones. They became the politicians, the civil servants, the military officers, the business leaders of the post-war era. They built a country that reflected what they had learned in the skies over Germany. That identity is not a weakness in a coalition. It is a strength. Because a nation that knows who it is fights harder than one that has been told to forget. The airfields in Yorkshire are quiet now. The runways have crumbled or been plowed under. The control towers stand empty. But in the institutional architecture of the Canadian military, the echoes of those cold Yorkshire nights remain. Every Canadian unit that deploys abroad carries, in some invisible way, the legacy of the men who insisted that their name belong on the war. In the end, it was never really about airplanes. It was about names, about who gets to claim a sacrifice, about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, about the difference between fighting a war and being recognized as having fought it. Canada, in the years between 1939 and 1945, gave everything a small nation could give. It built the world's largest air training system. It produced more than 130,000 aircrew. It spent nearly $2 billion. It sent tens of thousands of its young men overseas, and nearly 10,000 of them never came home from the bombing campaign alone. For much of that time, those contributions were invisible, swallowed into the vast mechanism of the Royal Air Force, reported in newspapers as British achievements, mourned in Canadian homes but uncredited in British histories. The men flew, the men fought, the men died, and the headline said RAF, the formation of number. 6 Group changed that, not overnight, not perfectly, but irrevocably. It placed a Canadian name on the most dangerous work of the air war. It gave a nation its reflection in the conflict. It ensured that when the history was written, it would include a chapter about Canada. Coalition warfare is, by its nature, an exercise in shared sacrifice. Nations pool their resources, their people, their blood, in pursuit of a common objective. But sharing does not mean surrendering, and sacrifice without attribution is not partnership. It is absorption. Canada understood this. perhaps more keenly than any other Allied nation, because Canada had lived it in the First World War. It had sent its sons to Vimy and Passchendaele and learned, in the worst possible way, that if you do not insist on your own name, others will write you out of the story. The struggle for 6 Group was not a rebellion against Britain. It was an assertion of self, a reminder that the nations of the Commonwealth were not provinces of an empire, but sovereign peoples, each with its own dignity, its own grief, its own right to stand in the light of their own achievements. The men who flew those Lancasters and Halifaxes over the Ruhr and Hamburg and Berlin were not thinking about national identity. They were thinking about flak and fuel and navigation and survival. They were thinking about the empty chairs in the mess and the missions still to come. They were thinking about home. But back home, a nation was watching. And because of the deal that was fought for and won, that nation could see its own children in the sky, could mourn them as its own, could honor them as its own, could remember them as its own. In war, victory is essential, but memory is what endures. And the question that lingers, long after the last engine has fallen silent, is not simply whether the war was won. It is who gets remembered for winning it. Canada made sure it would be remembered, not with monuments or speeches, though those came later, but with something more fundamental, a name, a number, a group designation on a mission report filed in the cold early hours of a Yorkshire morning that said clearly and without ambiguity, these men were ours. And that, in the end, is what the deal was about. Not aircraft, not strategy, not the politics of empire, but the right to grieve your own dead by name, the right to tell your own story, the right to exist visibly in the history of a war that might otherwise have forgotten you entirely. The skies above Yorkshire are quiet now. The bombers are gone. But the question remains, unanswered and eternal. In war, what matters more? Victory alone? Or who gets remembered for it?